Hi, Halima. Welcome to Better Tech. Let's first have a quick introduction about yourself for our audience.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Halima Iqbal. I'm the CEO and founder of Oraan. And my background is in investment banking and consulting, primarily in North America. I'm also a certified chef and have founded a food tech company previously in Toronto.
Wow, I did not know that about you. That's certainly something interesting. So, Halima, the topic that we have for today is fintech and financial inclusion in emerging markets. And just to kind of elaborate on your previous experience, you worked in consultant and analyst roles before. How did you get the idea to start Uran?
So I moved back to Pakistan late 2017, early 2018, after spending about 10 years in North America. And I very quickly realized that women in finance were very limited in Pakistan, but also finance for women was extremely restricted and limited. And just to give you a little bit of context, 5% of the entire world's unbanked population of women actually reside in Pakistan, where a $10 billion opportunity completely goes untapped because women are not considered economically viable. Products are largely made by men for men in the financial sector. So I started exploring because I had a really hard time accessing financial services, just simple things like opening up a bank account. And it took me 3.5 months when I moved back to open up that bank account, which made me realize that what was happening in the formal financial space in Pakistan, and if women were having such a hard time accessing financial services, how are they banking? How are they saving? How are they taking credit? So started with research with my co-founder who has a design background, and really tried to understand the relationship with money that people had in Pakistan, but also what are the alternative means that they were using to get by day-to-day banking services, right? Very quickly realized that while the formal economy does not necessarily serve women, they have created their own systems in the form of roskas, commonly known as committees in Pakistan. There are these rotating savings and credit associations, which actually serve their banking needs. So we started understanding that space a little better and came understood the market opportunity, what the business model could look like, and really sitting with the customer and testing it out.
Right. And for those who are not familiar, what is Uran and what does it do?
So Uran is Pakistan's first women-led, women-first neobank. Using a culturally and religiously acceptable product, which is your Roscas or committees, as the first product to really financially include women.
Right. And Halima, so when talking about, like you mentioned that it took you 3.5 months to open up a bank account. So why do you think that is? What is something that kind of stood out when you were exposed to the Pakistani financial market?
So like I mentioned, right, like products are largely made by men for men. So your logistical, your social barriers, your KYCs are all done according to what the requirements of men would be. Even today, like if you walk into a bank and you say, "Hey, I want to open up a bank," as a woman who might not necessarily be employed or would have her own business, um, bank is not going to cater to you. They will always identify or try to figure out your identity attached to your male counterpart. And
Right.
those were different kinds of struggles that I faced, where they kept on saying I don't need a bank account. And if I do need a bank account, I should get into a joint bank account with my father or my husband. Even today, like after spending 2.5 years in Pakistan running business, I can't access a credit card. So these are the realities in the market that we operate in. And I told you about the macro level, like 5% of the unbanked population of women actually reside in Pakistan. But when you look at it from more Pakistani lens, just 7% of the Pakistani population of women are financially included when we make up half of this country's population.
So, what is one thing, in your opinion, that people get wrong about financial startups, especially those that are focusing on financial inclusion?
I think there's always a battle between banks and fintechs, right? What we're doing is leveraging technology to provide faster access to financial services so that people are able to take control of their financial futures.
Right.
And I think what gets wrong in this, especially from when you look at finance from a gender perspective, women are largely ignored, and it's just not in Pakistan; it's all over the world as well, especially your emerging markets. So that battle and that struggle between banks and fintechs exists, but what because the problem is so large, we're not here as competitors. We're actually here as fintechs to really collaborate and take the existing services that are in the market and just give access to the common user faster in a more simplified manner, in a language that they understand, because banking and financial products can get very, very complex. So our job as fintechs is to simplify that entire experience without being extremely intrusive.
So it's one thing to kind of work on the access of these financial services when it comes to operating in emerging markets, and then there's another thing that the user like actually uses those services, avails those services. So how do you aim to mitigate that gap between financial inclusion and financial literacy in developing markets like those of Pakistan?
So to in terms of the rates of financial literacy in Pakistan, there's a World Bank report that shows that while 55% of women in Pakistan are financially literate, but that means that they're aware of basic financial terms. But when you ask them about like current account, insurance, credit literacy, it drops to about 18%. So the awareness levels decrease for more complex words with variations observed between provinces and urban and rural divide. And that makes up on a national level that awareness is just at 18%. What we do in terms of when you're including people in the financial services, you're not only providing them with market access, but you're also providing them with financial literacy, and breaking down those complex terms into very, very simple language and creating experiences around that for them to be able to then access the services that you're complementing with that literacy.
Okay. And how, again, if you were to elaborate further on it, how does Oran work on improving women's financial empowerment?
Absolutely. So what we do is we provide them with access in terms of your credit, insurance, and savings. In the form of a ROSCA, which they are very, very familiar with. And there's also one thing that I want to point out, especially when we're working in Pakistan and working from a gender perspective. There is a religious sensitivity that gets ignored when you're building these financial products. So it was very important for us to sit with the customer, understand their struggle, whether it is going into a bank and opening up a bank account, or whether it is that digital literacy that you need to be able to operate your bank accounts or your applications from your phone. We sit with them, we understand them, and then we build experiences around their requirement, rather than saying that, hey, this is what we think is a great idea and you should adopt it. So we work in a very human centric design methodology, ways to really listen to the customer and then include them and build with them, rather just building for them.
Okay. So, if we take a step back and look at the emerging markets apart from that of Pakistan, how is financial inclusion constrained? Like, apart from, you mentioned gender inequality is one aspect of it. What are some of the other things that, you know, are very, very evident, or something that you've personally come across as well?
So I think there is, when you talk about access, and when you talk about access in emerging markets, you need to look at disaggregated data. Whether it is the languages that they speak, whether it is a financial, digital, numerical literacy that they could potentially have or not have, and build on that. And I think smartphone ownership, while it is increasing rapidly in emerging markets, there's also it is still skewed towards male ownership, and I can tell that's very much true in Pakistan. So when building for solutions, we really need to take these kinds of constraints, whether that's logistical and social, their literacy levels, and also the kind of products that they would require. Women's requirements in terms of accessing finances is not any different or substantially different than what man would need financial services for. It's just that how you approach that has to take into the entire the kind of disaggregated that data that you need to then be able to really solve for them.
Right. So, do you think digital financial services help improve access to financial services more, or more so on their usage? Like, where exactly does the focus lie?
I think it's both, because there are logistical and social and mobility issues, especially in Pakistan for women. Providing them access at the comforts of their home is extremely important for them to take up those financial services. But when you create solutions for them, you have to also understand what would penetrate into their lifestyles and not be a hassle for them. And that's really why we took a product that was so culturally and socially embedded. 41% of the Pakistani population actually uses these Roscas to as an alternative banking means. So for us, it was not about reinventing a wheel and completely bringing a new product that could serve their needs. It was just taking something that existed in the market, and it's not just Pakistani market. It's a $500 billion opportunity globally. Roscas are used in a lot of other countries as well. And we took that and we digitized it, not only making it easier for a woman to access it, but also understand it. Because since she's not comfortable in taking up a product, or her family is not comfortable in taking up some kind of a financial services, she will not move ahead. So you can create that
True.
product. It's
Yeah.
not about usage. It's the first hurdle is that trust, bridging that gap, and allowing her to have some kind of a sense of belonging in the financial services.
Okay, makes sense. So, Halima, countries like Pakistan, and I'm sure you're well aware since you're living here now, are experiencing an e commerce boom, and mobile phone access has also significantly increased, something that you mentioned before. But do you think has this translated into a proportionate increase in people opting for digital financial services?
I think we have a long way to go. I think payments um, is complicated to solve for, and I think it's a structural change that needs to come. And with RAST coming, which is an infrastructure play in terms of payments, will actually make it a lot easier for people to transact online and transact digitally. Because while there is a shift happening in terms of e-commerce booming and smartphone ownership, there's a very heavy dependency on cash still. And large part of it is that trust between the formal sector and the informal sector, lack of trust between the formal sector and the informal sector, but also
Yeah.
the ease of doing payments still does not exist. right? Until we don't solve for that, um, it becomes much harder for us to be able to solve for digital uptake of digital services collectively as an ecosystem. And I think the Central Bank of Pakistan is doing some phenomenal work in pushing that infrastructure out and making it easier for people to be able to transact.
Right. And is Oran also helping facilitate this?
Absolutely. I think we've actually, because we do a lot of we do a lot of financial literacy along with providing market access. We've actually shifted behaviors and moved people into the formal banking space and gave them that trust that they needed to get to take up financial services, and provided experiences around the current infrastructure that makes it easier for them to be able to transact online.
Right, right. So, Halima, how would you define fintech in one sentence?
Leveraging technology to democratize financial access faster. I think fintech has existed, financial technology has existed for a really long time. What we're doing differently is just leveraging to provide access at a faster pace.
And speaking of that, how has financial innovation blurred the regulatory boundaries of the financial system? And how different is it in the developed world versus the developing world?
So I think it's about collaborating with the regulator. And right now, especially in Pakistan, the regulator is extremely open to different suggestions, is listening for the first time, and is looking for different kinds of innovation to drive financial inclusion. Because we're in 2021, our financial inclusion numbers are scary. We're still at 21%, which is a very, very scary number. So the regulator is looking for different kinds of innovation and willing to work with fintechs who are solving for very specific needs of the customer. You have to understand we're a population of 220 million people.
Mhm.
We're the fifth most populous country in the world. And we really, now it's time that we work not just with the regulator, but also the financial institutions to come up with creative solutions that could collectively help the economic growth of the country along with financially including people.
Right? Yeah. But certainly we have a long way to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But we're
So,
moving at a faster pace than we have ever moved before. So I think that's a good sign.
yeah, that's definitely a good sign. So, how does increased reliance between fintech and big data companies benefit the financial situation in emerging markets?
I think a lot of it is around profiling. If I can understand the customer better, and if I can understand their requirements better, I will be able to service them better, and their uptake is going to be higher. So it is really important to work closely and have open databases to be able to access uh, the information that we need to then be able to provide services in a simplified manner to the customer.
Right. And you touched upon this earlier. So, just to come back to it again, to what extent is soft information and face to face contact necessary for efficient financial service provision? Or do you think financial service provision can be reduced to arm's length digital decision making?
I think it can be reduced to digital decision making, and I think it has. We've seen examples all around the world. The customer is also coming online faster. She's understanding her mobility and her logistical barriers as well. But
Mhm.
she's because she's coming online faster, she's willing to take up more control of her financial future. So providing her with services digitally is actually one of the best ways to go about in markets like Pakistan to create faster access.
Right. And where does the trade off between an open and contestable financial system and the necessary regulatory framework lie?
See, I think it has to go hand in hand, right? The regulator, because finance is such a regulated space, there are always going to be some gray areas where you can work in. But
Mhm.
but not the regulators come and will come and knock at your door and not let you do things that are not in the benefit of the customer. So if you're working within the realms of what the regulator asks you to, create a strong enough use case, and then go talk to the regulator to be able to change and shift policies. And we're seeing examples of that happening in Pakistan right now, which is an extremely exciting space to be in. You do identify something that the regulator might not have been able to. You go and have conversations with them, and you're able to change the policies, and you're able to change and come up with new regulations. And we're seeing that EMI came about, digital banking licenses coming about in Pakistan. So things are moving, but it's a two-way street. There's only so much the regulator will be able to do, but if you don't raise your hand and voice your concern and opinion, nothing's going
Mhm.
to move.
Yeah. So this brings me to the last question for today's episode. How will emerging technologies like 5G improve the financial inclusion situation again in emerging markets?
It opens up room for creativity and innovation and for services to evolve, right? However, correct implementation of these newer technologies is extremely critical. And rather than playing catch up with what has happened previously, I think we need to start thinking out of the box and become market leaders in solving for cases that are also hyper local. We're a very heavy population. Our needs and requirements are not always the same as our comparables. So we really need to think out of the box and innovatively here to really make a dent in the ecosystem.
Right. So thanks, Lima. This brings us to the end of today's episode. It was wonderful hosting you on a discussion around the financial landscape in Pakistan.